The Soviet economy was the second largest and arguably the second most successful economy in the 20th century. At its height, it has a GDP of $2 trillion, and it was a self-sufficient economy that produces its own fuel, machinery, consumer goods, food, etc. The Soviet economy had an annual GDP growth of 5% for 42 years long, meaning that they outperformed all countries in the 20th century except for Japan. And it grew from a poor country wrecked by famines and civil wars into a power that rivaled the United States. But of course, it has entirely collapsed. Now, the standard criticism of the Soviet economy is that socialism could have never worked, and it was a big mistake to try the system in the first place. And while there are certainly many things wrong with the Soviet Union, the fact that they managed to grow rapidly and turned a nation with extreme poverty to become economically sufficient must mean that they've done something right. Even other poor nations with little to no hope of growing like China and Vietnam eventually embraced the Soviet economic system, with varying results. So, to address the standard criticism of the Soviet economic growth, we need to address that yes, the government did do lots of bad things like forced collectivization that led to massive famine and political repression. But collectivization isn't the cause for Soviet rapid growth. Instead, the steps that they implemented for achieving economic growth weren't evil and did not have dire consequences. So it can be a good case study of how to grow an economy. The second criticism of the Soviet economic growth is that it did not improve the people's lives, but this is also wrong. If the GDP increase only consists of weapons and tanks, then we can dismiss any economic growth as a failure. But consumption in the Soviet Union is actually quite high. Food consumption and calorie intakes, for example, were comparable to nations like the US and UK, although the food quality was undeniably worse. But amidst all of its successes, Soviet economic growth began to slow in the 1970s and dropped from 5% to 2.5%. The economy began to run out of gas in the 1980s, and soon, economic chaos and political pressure caused the breakup of the Soviet Union. This served as a paradoxical question. Why was growth so rapid from 1928 to 1970? And why it all went downhill after 1970 all the way to its collapse? So what happened here? Well, before considering the failures, let's begin by examining its successes. In 1928, the Soviet Union was being starved of capital, and they had lots of workers employed inefficiently in agriculture. So, the keys to Soviet rapid growth are 1. The rise of capital investment, and 2. The reallocation of land, labor, and capital from inefficient agricultural production into much more lucrative and efficient heavy industry and machinery. Both were the focus of Stalin's first 5-year plan. To effectively build up its capital, the Soviet dedicated 86% of its existing industrial investment budget to heavy industry. They opened huge new industrial centers in previously uninhabited areas rich in natural resources. Like this factory east of Ural Mountains rich in iron and steel reserves. As economic activity was pushed in the direction of heavy industries, millions of people left the countryside for the cities to work in factories. Many experts were hired from the West to help the Soviets learn how to operate machinery that was new to them. In this photo, for example, a tractor instructor was posing with 3 of his students. There's also an emphasis on producing producer goods, aka goods that can be used to produce more goods. Things like machinery, power stations, and railways. These goods provided raw materials, electricity, and means of transportation that was used to produce even more steel, machines, and electricity, creating a positive feedback loop. This all worked really well. From 1928 to 1940, the number of Soviet workers in industry, construction, and transport almost tripled from 4.6 million to 12.6 million, and factory output soared. The investment rate increased from 8% in 1928 to 20% in the mid-1930s. These massive investments and focus on heavy industry became the cornerstone of the Soviets' early growth, making them a leading industrial nation. But this doesn't mean that all goes well. Because the Soviets put too much emphasis on producing lots of things quickly, there were concerns that quality was neglected in favor of quantity. Moreover, by producing so many goods at once, sometimes those goods weren't even used properly and just stashed and rots in warehouses. Economic data were often exaggerated to make the country look good, and because of central planning, there were some unproductive investments being made. But for the most part, the Soviets successfully industrialized their nation. Another important policy for Stalin's first 5-year plan was collectivization. Under this policy, farmers were forced to give up their individual farms and join a collective farm, where the share of crops for each farmer is determined by the state. The main argument was that a large collective farm can use heavy machinery more effectively and produce larger crops compared to many small independent farms making their own decisions. Not only that, but it's also easier for the state to control just one large farm than many small farms. Of course, people resisted this collectivization and it turned bloody. Farmers who resisted were deported to prison camps, and a major famine that killed millions happened in 1932 and 1933. Now, the Soviets did gain a little bit from this collectivization. The agricultural products that they gained by force helped to fuel capital investment in heavy industry, and it helped to cause migration from the countryside to big cities, adding more workers for the factories. But I'm not sure that the benefit outweighed the cost of millions of people dying from famine and oppression. This paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research, for example, titled "Was Stalin Needed for Russia's Economic Development?", came to the conclusion that collectivization added nothing to economic development and only caused numerous human suffering. In other words, Stalin wasn't really needed. This strategy of industrialization came to its peak during the Second World War. You see, World War II and the years after was when the Soviets really focused on developing as much stuff as possible. They constantly borrowed and copied Western technology to increase productivity and push more and more women into the workforce. But moving on to the 1970s, the country simply ran out of gas. As the Soviets were able to catch up to the West, there was no new technology to copy anymore, and everyone already had a job. Even most women have already entered the workforce, with around 51% of all workers in the Soviet Union being women. Because of this, massive investments into heavy industry simply failed to generate much growth. Furthermore, the flaws of communism began to show up. Central planning caused inefficiencies in pricing everywhere, which makes for a thriving black market. And under the common economic system, there's no real drive for innovation since managers were rewarded for maintaining the status quo, especially since entrepreneurship was not allowed back then. Another factor that caused the Soviet economic downfall was simply bad decisions by its leaders. During Leonid Brezhnev's leadership, the Soviet Union fought an arms race against the Americans. This means that the Soviet defense spending kept ballooning, diverting important resources from civilian to military, which became increasingly burdensome through the 1980s. For example, the oil and gas industry, which was one of the most important sectors for the Soviets, was starved of capital investment. The equipments were getting old and pipelines began to leak, but there was no money available for reconstruction, let alone expansion. In 1980, 34% of industrial equipment was more than 10 years old, and the average piece of equipment was 8 to 9 years old. And this goes back to the flaws of central planning. You see, not only that investment capital just wasn't available, but there was no real incentive for factory managers to replace old equipment with new equipment. Replacing machinery and building new ones means a machine will stop running for a period of time. Factory managers that were given strict quotas by the government oftentimes cannot risk replacing old machinery because they will miss a production quota. Even when they did risk doing this, they would instead try to upgrade and refurbish this old crumbling equipment. During the 1960s, for example, there was a widespread movement in the Soviet Union to modernize old equipment. And as you can guess, it went pretty badly. It didn't have any positive effects like an increase in output or a reduction in labor, meaning that a lot of money was spent for nothing. Another factor that contributed to the Soviet downfall was resource depletion. The Soviet Union was blessed with abundant natural resources, but as time went on, it began to look like a curse. Before 1970, most oil plantations and coal mines were located in western Russia, where the terrain is favorable, making it easy to extract these resources. But in the 1970s, as resources were depleted, they were forced to expand their production to the Siberian mountains and jungles, where the terrain is rough and inhospitable. This proved to be a huge challenge since it became far more expensive to extract these resources. For example, let's look at the Soviets' production of iron ore. Between 1960 and 1980, production increased from 142 million to 502 million. making the Soviet the world's largest iron ore producer. And this was with 15 mines accounting for 80% of all iron ore production. But each year, these mines were dug deeper by 5 to 12 centimeters. As the pit became deeper and the route to the surface became longer, it requires more expensive equipment to extract these iron ores. Alternatively, they can look for new mines in the Siberian mountains. But again, this is also an expensive solution that required lots of new equipment. That is, if they can find a suitable iron ore reserve in the first place. And similar things were happening in the oil and coal sector, with output falling by more than 20% in the 1980s. By the way, this phenomenon is called the Ricardian trap in economics. The depletion of existing raw materials meant even greater costs if the output was increased from either new regions or already exploited ones. There were two potential solutions for this problem. 1. Import raw materials, and 2. Reduce demand for raw materials. But the Soviet trade policy wasn't suitable for this. You see, the Soviets were the exact opposite of Japan. Japan has few natural resources, so it was forced to rely on imports. This is a hard obstacle, but as transport costs fell rapidly after World War II due to constant innovation in shipping, it meant that Japan could shop around the world for the cheapest resources that they could find. The Soviet Union instead were trying to be self-sufficient in everything, and they've actually succeeded remarkably at this. The Soviets were one of the biggest producers in the world. Many of those mines wouldn't be profitable if they were evaluated at world prices. But for the Soviet, that's not the point. Their target was to be self-sufficient, not to generate profits. This strategy worked well when natural resources were abundant and extracting them was cheap. But as supply became remote to the Siberian mountains, costs skyrocketed and investment were made without any gain. So in essence, the Soviet grew rapidly from 1928 to 1970 because it accumulated capital investment and created industrial jobs for people working in agriculture. But it all went downhill in the 1970s because of external and internal reasons. The external reasons were the Cold War and the arms race with the US, and the internal reasons were the end of surplus labor economy, aka everyone already had a job in the factories, bad decisions by the Communist Party, a problem of incentives, and ever-depleting natural resources. Now, another interesting topic about the rise and fall of economies is Japan. If you want to learn about it, I have made a video explaining the mechanism behind the massive bubble of the 1980s and the everything crash in the 1990s, leading to 30 years of economic stagnation. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.